Exciting for us. I'm glad to see that we have a good audience. This is part one of a 4-part lecture series that was created by our education committee in consultation with our research committee. They go hand in hand, and we've had crossover from both committees working on this project. We have educational themes for 2016, which are 18th century medicine, 18th century food, 18th century wine, and 18th century clothing. So all of the lectures will focus on one of those topics. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pam Ward, who is the chair of our education committee.
Thank you. I'm a volunteer, as many of you are, here at Historic Christ Church. As well as being on the education committee, I'm a docent. And I noted, as did a number of my friends, that people ask questions about what life was like in the late 17th, early 18th century. Not for just those like Robert Carter, who was probably the richest man in Virginia at the time, but for the everyday people. We are really proud of our research committee. Kathy Galvano is currently, am I losing it? Okay, there we go. I'm a teacher voice, but sometimes it fades in and out. Kathy Galvano is currently chair of the research committee, and we have people doing really interesting research. Last year in our continuing education program, to which you all are invited, by the way, we had presentations by our research committee that were absolutely splendid. So it's important that our whole community is aware of what the research committee is doing. It is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ann Davis, who is a member of our research committee, has extensive credentials in history and in public management, and has been doing a lot of work in the area of medicine in the early 18th century. She is going to give us a real insight into what was happening to people who became ill on the Northern Neck as far back as we know. Thank you very much. Dr. Davis, are you using?
Thank you. No, I think I'm wired. The 18th century in Virginia was called the Golden Age. Many historians use that term. And it's true, Virginia was outstanding in many different areas. Government, commerce, education. But one author, historian Clifford Dowdy, points to Robert Carter as the prototype of the generation, and the generation being the people who were responsible for the Golden Age. Dowdy reminds us that Robert Carter was wealthy and powerful. He had 300,000 acres, 44 separate plantations, 1,000 slaves, and if you think you're living in quiet little Weems, 300 years ago, Dowdy said his home plantation resembled a thriving town. There was shipbuilding. He built ships for the inland waterways. He had stores that, quote, traded everything under the sun. So it was in this frame of mind, thinking of the Golden Age of Robert Carter, that I went with a group from the Foundation for Historic Christ Church on a trip to Williamsburg. And one of the speakers, no doubt knowing that we were from Christ Church, Robert Carter's home parish, read a proclamation that Robert Carter had given in 1727. This is going to be tricky. The proclamation was approximately 6 months before he posed for this. So this is a very accurate representation. All right, what's happening?
Push and release.
Okay, the proclamation was made at the governor's palace, and Robert, who helped me tremendously with his slides, checked, and the diary said yes, he was in Williamsburg, so this was delivered in person. And this is the proclamation. We don't expect you to be able to read it. But the proclamation was declaring a day of fasting and prayer and humiliation. The reason? A, quote, violent sickness and grievous mortality. And the day of fasting and repentance was to be spent in churches, listening to sermons that were, quote, suitable to the occasion. So, this was not Golden Age material, and I started thinking what was happening, what was it about the Golden Age that we didn't know or hadn't thought about. Whoop. The two terms that pretty well explain what was not golden are these two. Distemper is a wonderful broad term that covers everything from allergies to Zika, if they had had Zika. Physic was whatever they did to treat the distempers, which is another good term. It says not surgery because surgery was distinct. If you had surgery done, it was referred to surgery. Everything else was physic. The person to whom I went first was Wyndham Blanton. He was a physician, an historian, and a Virginian. His research was impeccable. He used county records and all sorts of things besides just libraries and books. It was his contention that physic in the 18th century was just the same as physic in the 17th century. There had been no improvement in 100 years in his estimation. The reason was that there were no theories that worked. People did not understand what made the body work, the different body systems, and how distempers affected those systems. One of the favorite theories dated back to Hippocrates, and you would have think they might have learned that it didn't work, but they didn't. He had 4 humors, the black bile, the yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. But it was not that simple. Each humor was related to a state of mind. Each humor was also related to a season, an organ in the body, a quality such as warm, moist, cold, or dry, and to one of the 4 classical elements, earth, air, fire, and water. So good health, obviously, was to get all this in sync and get the right amount of each in the body, which was difficult. So the question becomes, what was it that Robert Carter had experienced that made him declare the day of fasting? The short answer is we don't know. The one source of much of this material was the Virginia Gazette. It did not begin publication until 10 years after Robert Carter's proclamation. Robert Carter's surviving diaries ended the previous year. We do have his letters, but they skipped a 4-month period that includes the proclamation. However, there was one letter 4 weeks after the proclamation. It said pretty much the same thing, a grievous mortality and swept away an abundance of my people. But again, he doesn't say what it was. So, most historians, and certainly Wyndham Blanton, think it had to be one of a group of infectious diseases. The first, the ague and fever, is malaria, but no one called it malaria. It was fever and ague, or ague and fever. Sometimes it was the intermittent fever because chills and fever alternated. And the snake is the shivers and the chills, and the fever is the monster, and the doctor writes a prescription and background. Of all the distempers, this was probably the most prevalent. And it was exacerbated by the living conditions in the northern neck, close to water, swampy, low, and the culprit being, oh, come on, mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito. Virginia's first historian was Robert Beverly, and he wrote, the first sickness that any newcomer happens to have, intermittent fevers, as well as their agues, are very troublesome. And not only was it the first sickness, but it had a name. It was called the seasoning. So the first bout of malaria that anyone had was the seasoning. And unfortunately, the seasoning was the introduction to life in this part of the country. The slaves were forced to undergo the seasoning, although some were immune. It all depended on where they were from in Africa and the presence or not of the mosquito. The Indians are the group that is said to have suffered the most. One 17th-century source said the Indians were willing to trade all their possessions for clothes to keep them warm, and they had chills. Landon Carter's daughter, Suki, died of malaria. He said to be confined a whole year in tending one sick children. Mine now are never well. And 6 months later, Suki died on April the 25th. It also may have been the ague and fever that caused Robert Carter to sign his will. His diary entries on August the 18th report taken with the fever and ague. 2 days later, a violent fit ague, very severe. 2 days later, signed my will, very uneasy. The Nobel Prize for discovering the cause of yellow fever was 1902. Of malaria. Yellow fever is the next infectious disease this could have been. It was called yellow fever or yellow jack because in the second stage it compromised liver function and did produce a yellow color. Dr. John Mitchell of Tappahannock said in 1727, I have seen 30 or 40 cases, mostly among the slaves. Well, he was in Tappahannock, and the disease was spread on seagoing vessels from Africa and from the islands in the Caribbean. So if Tappahannock had 30 or 40 cases, the assumption is that it was a severe epidemic elsewhere. By the end of the century, there was a quarantine. Light Horse Harry Lee was governor, and he said all vessels sailing from either Philadelphia, the Grenadines, or the island of Tobago had to all anchor off Craney Island at the mouth of the Elizabeth River for 20 days. And during that time, no person or goods could leave the ship. The next possibility is typhus, typhoid fever. They are two different diseases, but they didn't know that then, and the names were used interchangeably, but we're probably talking epidemic typhoid. It is caused by an organism that lives in small mammals, rats, raccoons, even flying squirrels. It's transferred to humans by the bite of a lice, tick, or flea. Typhus was also called prison fever or gaol, G-A-O-L, fever, or ship's fever. One interesting story about how easily it spread. In 1750, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Samuel Pennant, and a large number of court personnel were fatally infected in the courtroom of the Old Bailey, which was adjacent to Newgate Prison. And it was prisons and shipboards and close quarters where this disease spread so rapidly. Missing one. This is gold fever. Captain Augustine Washington and Captain Hugh French took their passage. Former has arrived in health, but the latter died at sea. 'Tis said of the gold fever which he got on board. So it did hit in this area. The Nobel for that was given to a Frenchman in the early 1900s who identified the body louse as the cause. The next is smallpox, or the red plague. And smallpox generally did not prove fatal, but sometimes the eruptions could spread to the cornea and cause blindness. This was another disease that was spread by ships coming from Africa. So the seacoast towns, Charleston, New York, Boston, had the worst epidemics. But again, we were not immune. Also, before it came to the colonies, the close ties the colonies had with England made smallpox a serious thing in their lives. Robert Carter wrote The Merchants Who Helped Manage His Affairs in London about his son's case of smallpox. And I really like the last phrase. He called smallpox this cruel discouragement to an English education. I thought that was very nice. More sadly, William Byrd's wife died of smallpox, again in London when she was visited, by the very same cruel distemper that destroyed her sister. Benjamin Harrison at Berkeley had felt compelled to put this advertisement in the Virginia Gazette that it was now clear of smallpox and people could resume visiting because they had taken necessary care to cleanse. Okay, we have to take a little sidebar because it's interesting. Edward Jenner, at the end of the 1700s, discovered the vaccination for smallpox, and it was cowpox. It was a serum from cowpox disease, because cowpox was much less severe than smallpox. So that only happened at the end of the century. Up until then, all the references to inoculation are really references to a practice called variolation, which is taking live virus from a person who actively has the disease and giving it with a small pen scratch to someone who is well in the hopes of making them immune. So there's a wonderful story about how this came to the Western world. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was an English aristocrat born into a wealthy family. She was beautiful. She was learned. She corresponded with the leading lights of the day. In fact, Alexander Pope supposedly was madly in love with her and wrote poems flattering her. She turned him down, and then supposedly he wrote poems not flattering her. But she was a free thinker. When her father picked an Irish peer for her to marry, she eloped with Lord Montagu because she liked him better. But 2 years after her marriage, she contracted smallpox. Her brother died. She did not, but it left her deeply pitted and with no eyelashes. A year later, her husband was appointed ambassador to the court of the Ottoman Empire, which was Istanbul. She went with him. She pursued her free-thinking ways. She went out into the bazaars where there were tents of women. She wandered around and she saw vaccination being done. She was so impressed that she came home and had it done to her 5-year-old son. A year later, when she went back to London, she had 2 daughters who had apparently not gone with her to Istanbul, had them inoculated, and they all lived. She was the first person in the West to introduce inoculation. And she gets lots of credit for that. News spread rapidly. Even to Indian Creek. This is to inform the public that I have returned to my house at Indian Creek to inoculate for the smallpox. Now, he seems interested in making sure that he gets his money because he's going to be quarantined with his patients. But he was still willing to do the procedure and to quarantine himself with his patients. As you might have guessed, this procedure, variolation, was not always a sure thing. If you didn't get the right amount of live virus, you were in serious trouble. And in Williamsburg in 1769, there was a petition presented to the House of Burgesses that noted, quote, the destructive tendency of inoculation with smallpox, and therefore praying that no such practice may be allowed in Virginia. As far as we know, that was not acted upon. The last is the flux, or bloody flux, or looseness. And I give this here because it was a problem, and also because it is what one newspaper said caused the death of Robert Carter. This is the American Weekly Mercury, which was published in Philadelphia. And those of you who are Reading carefully, we'll notice that the date of his death is wrong. It was not the 7th. It says right here somewhere he died on the 4th. So the cause could also be wrong. But it does say that he died of the flux, which presumably, after a short indisposition, he died of the flux, which 'tis supposed he caught on board a vessel from which he bought several Negroes. Real quickly, some other diseases that to us are just nothing diseases. We don't even think about them. But they were major problems and sometimes even fatal in the 18th century. Measles. All our family had measles, 30 people. They all came through it, but Mary Braxton, daughter of the late Colonel Carter, then skipping down, she was lately delivered of a son and in a fair way of recovery, but unhappily catching cold, was soon carried off, and the child also died the following Monday. That's, well, one piece of good news. The last part is incorrect, and 3 weeks later they had to print a correction. Braxton Carter did not die, the son, and he lived to sign the Declaration of Independence. Can't talk about Distempers and Robert Carter without talking about gout. Huge problem. His diaries, his letters are just full of references. How he felt, what he took, what he ate. And I just give you a brief summary, which you can read while I try to get my papers in order. A very sad thing to me, which would never happen now, is how many times Robert Carter could not go to Williamsburg and perform his duties as a representative of his people. Another phrase that I really like, in 1724, he wrote Governor Hugh Drysdale saying he would be absent from the council in Williamsburg because, quote, "The gout hath been an inseparable companion to me all this winter." Quick word about the lifestyle. I'm not going to say whether that influenced or not the health of the people, but it was different. The first had to do with bathing. I came across a colonial Williamsburg monograph with the catchy title, "To Bathe or Not to Bathe." Coming clean in colonial America. It states that there is a 6-sided outhouse, probably dating from 1720, that's on the periphery of the governor's palace. However, their conclusion was that it was used for cooling down, not for bathing. The reason, quote, "Everyone knew that too much bathing would destroy your natural oils and leave you wide open to the ravages of various diseases." So bathing didn't happen often. Diets were very different. Now, admittedly, we're focusing on the plantation owner group. We're not talking about everyone, but this is one of Robert Carter's dinners. different estimate was at the end of the century in just Virginia, and the estimate was 8% degreed. In 1791, the Bill of Rights gave the states the right to regulate medical care and physicians, but they didn't do it for 60 years, so it was slow. If you couldn't go to a university and get a degree, surgeon's instruments, you could take an apprenticeship. Ramsey and Taylor said they would provide bed, board, and washing to a young man, and it would have been a young man. This is what most of the doctors were. Big, big problem. The problem was so acute that in 1639, the legislature had to pass a law. And the law distinguished between physicians who had degrees and those who did not. And it states that the reason they had to pass this law was, quote, avaricious men, more swayed by politics than Christian duty or charity, who neglected patients, overprescribed medications, and billed excessively. So the act gave jurisdiction to county courts. Is that it? And if someone had complaints about a bill, either the services or the drugs, they could go to the county court, and the county court would decide what was fair, and that decision would be binding. Another category of quacks is ship's doctors or ship's surgeons. William Byrd had not much respect for them, that know nothing about very common remedy. And I was impressed with William Byrd's comments because I found a letter from Robert Carter to Dr. Belfield, firing Dr. Belfield, who had been a ship's doctor. And Robert Carter said he was firing him because of stuffing my peoples with poisonous drugs that cost you nothing, neglecting my sick people when sent for, and failing to visit Coles Point Plantation above 2 or 3 times. Another one. This is too long to go into, but James Arbuckle of Accomack County felt it his duty to warn fellow readers about a German quack. He said, this German named Meyer shows a license with the names blotted out. And he claimed to have a large sum of money, quote, by which means he generally gains credit where he resides, paren, which is never longer than 2 or 3 months in a place. And then privately absconds. He ends by saying, Meyer is gone to the western shore of Virginia or Maryland, and he wants the readers to be careful. A couple of quick. Dr. Rowan, you can read some of the things he claims to cure. The second line over to the right, he even cures evil, which I think is very This is a man I'll refer to a couple of times in a moment, John Tennant, who his did was herbs. He thought the herbs that grew wild in Virginia could cure anything. And he was much opposed to compounding drugs. He wanted just simple herbs for each condition. But he was a true believer who kept front page arguments with the doctors on the front page of the Gazette. And this is one of them, just saying the physicians don't know what they're thinking about. I really know, and they don't listen to me. And here he says they are really the quacks because they don't try this and they don't know. But we'll talk about him later on. The apothecaries were another group, and you see women who occasionally helped mix in an apothecary shop. They were important because the London Company in 1624 sent 2 apothecaries to the Virginia colony. An article saying the unicorn's horn has gotten a new supply of medicine. This is Dr. James Carter's shop. He later moved his shop to the Duke of Gloucester Street, just west of Raleigh Tavern. And there was an empty lot where he built a brick building, divided it in half. Half he gave to his brother, who was a merchant, and half to his apothecary shop. George Pitt, at the sign of the rhinoceros, still stands today and is supposedly the oldest surviving apothecary shop in the country. Here's an apothecary who is not a doctor, just a chemist, but he is selling a parcel of medicines at Mrs. Sullivan's. Well, this too became very complex, so a law was needed. This law distinguished between degrees and non-degree providers. The first part at the bottom of the left page, surgeons and apothecaries who have served an apprenticeship to this trade shall be allowed, and it tells in pounds and shillings what they're allowed within 5 miles, 5 to 10 miles, and so on. In other words, it is setting their pay rates. At the top of the second is surgeons, and it tells what they can charge for a compound or simple fracture, a compound being double the simple. The last group is the group, quote, who have studied physic in any university and taken any degree therein. And these sums are roughly twice what was allowed for the undegreed. The next category is midwives, and they were used extensively. Landon Carter, for example, his wives all had short lives. His second wife, Maria, lived a little over 2 years and bore 1 child. So childbirth was very, very potentially dangerous. Mary Rose wanted to practice midwifery, and on the third and fourth lines, with the approbation of Doctors Pester and Galt, who were 2 of the best-known physicians in Williamsburg. So she's touting her credentials. Julia Wheatley just lists a lot of things that she can cure. She stated that she could cure the most inveterate ringworm, sore eyes, and many other disorders incident to both sexes. Okay, the male midwife comes into being. Not all midwives were wives, and not all were women. This is from the Gazette. It's a reprint from an article about the French Queen. The French Queen was so near her time that Monsieur Perard, the famous man midwife, was not suffered to stir from Versailles. Most of the man midwives that I came across were physicians. William Coakley said surgery, midwifery, physic. Dr. Lacoudre also said he could do, I profess all sorts of operations in surgery and man midwifery. The Gazette also advertised for instruments that were used, midwifery instruments. So if someone wanted to go into the trade, it was not too hard to pick up some instruments. And this is from Dr. John Walker. All right, we'll end midwifery with whole page of the Gazette. I guess a man wrote in saying male midwives were adulterous. There was just no two ways about it. It was a given. And he essentially said it would be a matter of indifference to him whether his wife was in a bordello or in an anteroom with a man. When you couldn't get a doctor or a surgeon or any of those people with expertise that you wanted, you really depended on friends and neighbors. James Gordon did this a lot. Mr. Waddell and Mr. Chichester were blooded by Colonel Taylor, who came to dinner. How would you like to be invited to dinner and then said you have to believe these people? All right, let's go to, I want that. Go backwards. So sorry. All right, we're going to have to do without that, but that's okay. Two sort of agencies that were responsible for providing health care in an indirect way were the vestries and the legislature. And I'd just like to mention a couple instances. This is a Vestry record. Now, the Vestry was 12 men who had responsibility for governing the parish, but who also had responsibility for social welfare. And this is 1725 Prince George's County, and just above the break upon the petition of Margaret Butler, and she appearing to this Vestry declaring that she being disabled by sickness. If you read the rest, the vestry next to the bottom paid the rate of 8 pounds of tobacco per month to a rich butler who may have been a relative to provide her diet, lodging, and washing. So they did take responsibility for seeing that she was taken care of. This is one of the things that got me interested in this topic in the beginning. The legislature granted freedom to the slave smallpox because he discovered a cure for yaws and venereal disease. And they gave him his freedom. They gave to his owner, Francis Littlepage, 50 pounds of current money to compensate. They also gave, right above the break resolve, the sum of 100 pounds be paid out of public money to Constant Woodson as a reward for curing cancer. Isn't that nice? All right, I'm skipping over some of this. These are orders of drugs, and almost every order to London had drugs listed that they wanted. About 4 or 5 down, 2 pounds Jesuit bark, and 1 pound liquid laudanum, which we'll talk about in a moment. All right, what did these caregivers do? Well, the first thing they did was bleed, and they bled for everything. Here's another picture. And I'm sure you've heard that the barber's pole dates back from the bleeding, the white being the tourniquet, and the red being the blood. These are all the places in the body you could bleed, which is just about everything. Okay, I don't know how much you know about George Washington's death, but we have to talk about that. He died in the last month of the last year of the century, and he was 67. He went out to inspect his property on a December late afternoon when it was raining, sleeting, very cold. He was out for 5 hours. Company was coming for dinner, but he prided himself on his punctuality. So he came straight in and went to the dinner table without changing. Later on that night, he became ill. He called a team of surgeons, including the surgeon who had been with him in the war. And the first thing they did was bleed him. And in fact, over a period of 12 hours, 3 different sessions, they bled him of about 40% of his blood. Now, in their defense, they thought we had more blood than we do. So, but anyway. They also gave calomel, which we'll talk about in a moment, as a purgative. And they blistered him. They applied blisters to his throat, because his throat was sore, to his arms, to his legs, feet, and hands to draw out the deadly humors. He died that night, and the doctors left very good records of what his symptoms were and what was done. And he died, they think, of a bacterial illness, but there's no doubt that the blooding and the treatment that he contributed. So, briefly, blistering was the application of a caustic substance on a piece of material just applied directly to a part of the body. And if that stuff dried, it obviously made fluids come from the body. And if the caustic substance dried up, they just put more on it, kept on blistering. Drugs were used mainly as purgatives or emetics because they wanted the digestive tract clean no matter what was wrong. So real quickly, some of the drugs they used, and again, a complete listing of drugs is hundreds, but a complete listing includes things like Brinkwell's purging elixir of peppermint, or Will's original owl water, or grains of paradise. Blanton says there are 5 or 6 basic drugs, and those are the ones that really were mentioned in the material. Calomel, we've already mentioned, has been given to Washington. Interestingly, Thomas Dimmesdale put in the Gazette how to inoculate, and he goes on to say you give them calomel, you give them a purgative. The second is laudanum, which you saw on the list. Laudanum is opium. It's about a 1% solution. It was very popular. Interestingly, it was not until the 19th century that you needed a prescription to get opium. The next is Ipecac, I-P-E-C-A-C, and that was very popular. It was an emetic to induce vomiting, but always popular. The next was snake root, and that's the one that John Tennant, the one who loved his herbs, was so enamored of. John Tennant did give credit to the Indians. They used it, and they found it effective against rattlesnake bites. However, he said many distempers, including pleurisy, gout, and pneumonia. The rattlesnake root, William Burr didn't think to, said has done wonders in the gout. It is of great use in the dropsy and has recovered several from that fatal distemper. But William Byrd, no, sorry. All right, another I give up. All right, have to finish with John Tennant though. He, even though he carried on these tirades and argued with the doctors and called them quacks and all of that, he published a book entitled Every Man His Own Doctor, and it was very, very popular. William Parks, who was the first publisher for the Virginia Gazette, published 2 editions of John Tennant's book, and Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia published 3 editions. He thought it was so important. And John Tennant got his revenge because in 1736, the House of Burgesses gave him £100 for his discovery of the use of Seneca snake root. All right, fast forwarding to the present. The Revolutionary War was something of a turning point because there had to be hospitals for soldiers, there had to be surgeons for tending the wounded, the medical schools were established, and there were departments of surgery. And even though George Washington got such poor care, by the end of the century, things were in place and the system was beginning to work, although not always. I wish I have to find this. My last word for you. I love it. So I think, and the cartoonists didn't even know that lice were the cause of disease. I mean, anyway, I think the short answer is all they had to go through to make it a golden age. I think they deserve a lot of credit.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and we hope that to see you on our continuing program of Saturday afternoon pieces of information that are interesting about the era of Christ Church. Thank you very much.